Engaging introduction. I always believed there were lines parents would never cross. I was wrong. When I found out my parents had stolen my daughter's cello and sold it for $87,000, it wasn't just an object they took. They shattered trust, broke my child's heart, and forced me to confront a truth I had avoided my entire life. Family doesn't always mean loyalty. His is the story of how I lost my parents and found my strength. My name is Amelia, and before betrayal ever entered my life, before lawyers, accusations, and silence replaced family dinners, there was only my daughter Lila and her music. She was the kind of child who heard the world differently. While other kids chased noise and chaos, Lila leaned toward stillness. She noticed patterns, how rain tapped different rhythms on glass, how footsteps echoed differently in hallways, how silence itself could feel loud. When she first touched a cello at school, something in her settled, as if the instrument had been waiting for her hands long before she was born. She was 6 then, small enough that the cello looked enormous beside her, yet she handled it with an instinctive reverence that made her teacher stop mid-sentence and just stare. By the time Lila turned 8, music was no longer a hobby. It was the axis around which her world turned. She practiced before breakfast, after homework, and sometimes late at night when she thought I couldn't hear her. My life partner, Daniel, would stand in the hallway listening, his hand resting on the wall as if the vibrations could pass straight through him. He once told me it felt like watching someone remember something they'd never been taught. That was how it felt to me, too. Like Lila wasn't learning the cello, but reclaiming it. The cello itself came from a place of half-forgotten family history. After my grandfather Henry passed away, a quiet man my parents rarely spoke about, a sealed storage trunk, was discovered in the back of his old workshop. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth and old handwritten notes, was the instrument. At first glance, it looked aged, but ordinary, scarred slightly along the edges, its varnish darkened by decades of careful use. But when Lila drew the bow across the strings for the first time, the sound filled the room in a way that made my chest tighten. It wasn't loud. It was deep, resonant, layered with something that felt almost alive. A local luthier heard Lila play during a small recital and asked to examine the cello afterward. His hands trembled as he turned it gently under the light, tracing markings hidden inside the body. Within weeks, experts confirmed what none of us had ever imagined. The cello was a rare Italian instrument, crafted by a lesser-known but highly respected maker, preserved in astonishing condition. Its estimated value hovered near 6 figures, a number so surreal it barely registered with me at first. To me, it was still just Lila's cello, the thing that made her eyes light up, the thing that steadied her when the world felt too big. Daniel urged caution immediately. He talked about insurance, climate-controlled storage, legal documentation. I listened, but I didn't feel fear. I felt pride that something beautiful and meaningful had found its way to my child, pride that our family history contained more than silence and tension. Even my parents, Robert and Elaine, seemed impressed when they visited and saw Lila play. My mother wiped her eyes dramatically, saying it must run in the blood. My father nodded with an expression that suggested ownership more than admiration, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. When our house needed major renovations, the question of where to keep the cello came up. I hesitated briefly. Daniel offered alternatives, but my parents insisted. They had space, they said, a quiet guest room, locked cabinets. Family protects. Family. My sister Margaret echoed the sentiment, telling me I was being paranoid even considering other options. Against a faint, nagging unease I couldn't fully explain, I agreed, believing that entrusting something precious to family was the safest choice of all. Handing the cello over to my parents felt, at the time, like a practical decision wrapped in familiarity. I remember carrying the case up their front steps myself, my arms tense, my grip too tight, as if my body already understood something my mind refused to accept. My mother, Elaine, hovered behind me, fussing about temperature and dust, promising she'd check on it every day. My father, Robert, opened the guest room closet with an almost ceremonial flourish, pointing out the solid wood shelves, the lack of windows, the sturdy lock. He spoke with authority, the same tone he used when I was a child, and disagreement wasn't an option. I told myself that was just how he was, that it didn't mean anything more. Lila kissed the cello case before we left. She asked if it would miss her. I laughed and said instruments didn't feel things the way people did, even as something uncomfortable twisted in my chest. Daniel watched quietly from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Later, in the car, he said softly that we should document everything again, just in case. I brushed it off, telling him he worried too much, reminding him that these were my parents, the people who raised me, who packed my lunches, who showed up to school plays even when they were tired. Trust, I insisted, had to mean something. The renovations dragged on longer than expected. Weeks turned into months, and life filled the space where concern might have grown. Lila adjusted to practicing on a borrowed student cello, but the sound frustrated her. She complained that it didn't respond to her, that it felt stiff and dull, like talking to someone who refused to listen. I promised her it was temporary, that her cello was safe, resting quietly, waiting for her return. Occasionally, she asked if we could visit it. I said soon. There always seemed to be a reason to delay. When I did stop by my parents' house alone one afternoon, the guest room door was closed. Elaine told me Robert had reorganized things and that it was better not to disturb the room until everything was finished. Her smile was thin, practiced. She talked too much, filling the air with unnecessary details about dinner plans and neighborhood gossip. I noticed the key to the guest room wasn't hanging on its usual hook, but I didn't press. I told myself I was being dramatic. That suspicion was unkind. My sister Margaret visited around that time, staying with our parents for a weekend. She mentioned in passing that the house felt emptier than usual, that my father seemed distracted, always on his phone. When I asked what she meant, she shrugged and changed the subject, asking instead about Lila's lessons, about whether she was still serious about music. The phrasing irritated me, but I ignored it, the way I'd ignored so many small slights growing up. As the renovation finally neared completion, I called my parents to arrange picking up the cello. There was a pause on the line, just a fraction of a second too long, before my mother said they needed a little more time. She said the lock had jammed, that Robert wanted to be there when we opened the closet, that it was better to wait a few days. After the call ended, Daniel looked at me and asked, very calmly, if I felt okay. I said yes, too quickly. That night, I lay awake replaying the conversation, hearing the hesitation, the careful choice of words, the way my name sounded different in her mouth. By the time we finally drove over together, Lila bouncing in the backseat with excitement, I was already bracing myself without fully understanding why. The house looked the same from the outside, neat and familiar, but the air inside felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Robert wasn't home yet, Elaine said. Margaret had left early that morning. The guest room door stood closed at the end of the hall, its handle catching the light, the space around it unnaturally quiet. I knew something was wrong the moment Elaine stopped walking and just stood there in front of the guest room door. Her hand hovered inches from the handle, trembling slightly as if the metal might burn her if she touched it. Lila squeezed my hand, her excitement fading into confusion, and asked why Grandma looked strange. I told her to wait in the living room with Daniel, my voice tight, already bracing for whatever was on the other side of that door. Elaine didn't argue. She didn't say anything at all. She simply stepped aside, her face pale, her lips pressed together like she was holding back a confession that had been rehearsed too many times. The closet was empty. Not reorganized, not moved. Empty in a way that felt deliberate, final. The shelves were bare except for a faint rectangular outline in the dust where the cello case had once rested. For a few seconds, my mind refused to process what my eyes were telling it. I actually leaned forward, half expecting the case to materialize if I looked hard enough, as if reality itself might correct the mistake. My ears rang, a dull pressure building behind my eyes. I asked where it was, my voice coming out quieter than I intended, stripped of emotion as if my body was conserving energy for something worse. Elaine sat down on the edge of the bed as though her legs had given out. She kept smoothing the blanket over and over, a nervous, useless motion. She said my name once, then stopped, swallowed, and said it again, slower this time. That was when I understood this wasn't about misplacement or confusion. This was something she had been preparing to explain. I asked again where the cello was, and this time my voice shook. She told me Robert wasn't home yet. She told me we should wait. She told me it was complicated. Complicated didn't bring the air back into my lungs. When Robert finally arrived, his reaction was worse than silence. He looked annoyed, not ashamed, not startled, just irritated that the moment had come. He glanced at the open closet, then at me, and said we should talk privately. Daniel refused to leave my side. Lila was still in the living room, humming softly to herself, unaware that something precious had already been taken from her. I told Robert to tell me now. The truth, I said, didn't improve with time. That was when he said the word sold. It landed in the room like a physical blow. I remember gripping the doorframe to stay upright, my nails digging into the wood. I asked him to repeat himself, convinced I'd misheard. He didn't. He said they had sold the cello, that it had been too valuable to just sit in a closet, that opportunities like that didn't come often. Elaine began to cry then, quiet, restrained sobs that sounded more like guilt than grief. I asked how much. Robert hesitated, then said $87,000, as if the number itself should soften the reality of what he'd done. I don't remember screaming, but Daniel later told me I did. I remember demanding to know how they could touch something that didn't belong to them, how they could take from a child, how they could look at me every day and lie. Robert's response was calm, almost cold. He said they'd raised me, that everything I had came from them in some way, that the cello was part of the family, whether I liked it or not. He said they needed the money. He didn't explain for what. He didn't think he had to. When I demanded to know who helped them, Elaine's eyes flicked away from mine, just for a second, toward the hallway. Margaret's name didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The realization settled heavily in my chest, a second betrayal stacking itself neatly on top of the first. Lila chose that moment to walk in, asking if it was time to see her cello. The look on Robert's face didn't change. The look on Elaine's did. She broke then, covering her mouth as if that could stop the truth from spilling out, as if silence could undo what had already been done. Lila's question hung in the air, fragile and hopeful, and for a brief, unbearable moment no one answered her. Elaine turned away, her shoulders shaking, while Robert crossed his arms like this was a negotiation he intended to win. I knelt in front of my daughter and told her we needed to go home, that there had been a misunderstanding. The word tasted like a lie the second it left my mouth. She looked past me, toward the hallway, searching for the familiar black case that should have been there, and when she didn't see it, her face crumpled in confusion rather than anger, which somehow hurt more. The drive home was silent, except for Lila's quiet sniffles and the steady rhythm of Daniel's hands gripping the steering wheel. My thoughts raced, looping back through every moment I had trusted my parents without question, every time I had defended them to Daniel, every warning sign I had explained away as personality, or stress, or harmless eccentricity. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the shock had hardened into something sharper, something that burned. That night, after Lila fell asleep, clutching her pillow instead of her cello, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table going over everything we knew. Dates, conversations, the exact words my parents had used. When I called Margaret, she didn't answer at first. When she finally did, her voice was cautious, measured, like someone stepping carefully across thin ice. She admitted she'd helped connect Robert with someone who knew auction houses, insisting she thought it was temporary, that she believed they were only getting the instrument appraised. Her explanation unraveled quickly under even the gentlest questions. She knew more than she was saying. She always had. The next day, I demanded the truth in full. We met at my parents' house again, this time without Lila. The guest room felt smaller, stripped of its pretense. Robert laid it all out with a bluntness that felt rehearsed. They had been struggling financially, he said. Medical bills, poor investments, things I supposedly wouldn't understand. When the appraisal confirmed the cello's value, he saw a solution sitting quietly in a closet. He talked about sacrifice, about everything they'd done for me growing up, about how parents were owed something in return. The cello in his mind had never fully belonged to me or my daughter. It belonged to the family, and he was simply the one bold enough to turn it into cash. Elaine nodded along, wiping her eyes, occasionally adding that they meant to tell me eventually, that they planned to give me some of the money once things settled. When I asked how much, she couldn't answer. When I asked when, she looked at Robert. The excuses piled up quickly: timing, fear, misunderstanding, each one insulting in its thinness. Margaret sat quietly on the couch, her silence loud, her hands folded tightly in her lap as if she were bracing herself against judgment she felt but didn't want to face. I asked for the money back immediately. Robert laughed, a short, humorless sound, and said it was already gone. He didn't explain how, only that it had been spent responsibly, that it had gone where it was needed most. That was the moment something shifted in me, something final. This wasn't panic or desperation. This was entitlement. This was a choice made calmly, repeatedly, with full awareness of who it would hurt. Daniel spoke then, his voice controlled but edged with anger, telling them what they'd done was theft, that sentiment and shared blood didn't change the law. Robert bristled at that, accusing Daniel of turning me against my own family, of poisoning me with ideas about boundaries and ownership. I realized then that, in his mind, I was still a child, still something he could override, still someone whose consent was optional. When I told him I would involve a lawyer, Elaine gasped like I'd threatened violence. Margaret finally looked up, her eyes wide, and said, "I was taking it too far, that we could handle this privately, that involving outsiders would destroy the family." I asked her what family remained when trust had already been sold for $87,000. The lawyer confirmed what I already knew in my bones. What my parents had done wasn't just a moral failure. It was a crime. The cello had been legally documented as Lila's property, held in trust by me. Its sale, carried out without consent, constituted theft. Hearing it stated so plainly should have brought relief, but instead it hollowed me out. There was no comfort in being right when the people on the other side of the truth were the ones who had raised me. Still, I moved forward, because every time I looked at Lila struggling to practice on a borrowed instrument, her confidence eroding piece by piece, I was reminded that protecting her mattered more than preserving an illusion of family unity. When my parents were formally served, the reaction was explosive. Robert called me repeatedly, leaving messages that swung wildly between rage and wounded pride. He accused me of humiliating him, of airing private matters in public, of choosing money over blood. Elaine sent long emails filled with apologies that never quite reached responsibility, each one carefully worded to express regret without admitting wrongdoing. She wrote about sleepless nights and stress and how she never meant for things to go this far, as if this distance had simply appeared on its own, uninvited. Margaret texted me to stop, to think about how this would look, to remember holidays and childhood memories like they were bargaining chips I was obligated to cash in. The court proceedings forced everything into the open: records from the auction house, bank transfers, signed documents bearing my father's name, all laid out in sterile detail. The figure, $87,000, appeared again and again, reduced to ink and paper, stripped of the music and meaning it once represented. Robert sat stiffly through it all, his jaw clenched, still unwilling to look at me directly. Elaine cried openly, drawing sympathetic glances from strangers who didn't know the full story, who couldn't see how carefully the betrayal had been planned. Margaret wasn't charged, but her involvement was acknowledged, her role no longer something she could hide behind silence. At home, the impact settled in quieter ways. Lila asked fewer questions as time passed, but the absence of music lingered in the corners of the house. She became hesitant, unsure of herself, her joy muted. Daniel tried to fill the space with encouragement, arranging lessons, finding temporary solutions. But trust, once broken, didn't repair easily, especially for a child. I watched her closely, carrying a constant, aching guilt for having put her in the care of people who valued profit over her happiness.